Good evening, everybody. My name is Jim Pouliot, and I'm president of the Sanctuary Golf Club. That's where you could apply. Enough, really. Thank you. I want to start by saying, go Red Sox. I mean, they are a Fort Myers team, right? So they're the local team. Well, welcome back. It's great to see everybody here tonight. Frankly, I've been here about 4 days, and I haven't seen this many in total the whole week. It seems like they're all here tonight, so that's great. This is obviously an issue that's really important for all of us who call Sanibel and Captiva home. And even those of us who aren't here all summer were clearly affected by the stories of what was taking place here. It was on the national news. I even had my friends in California who couldn't find Sanibel on a map if you spotted them Fort Myers, asking about what's going on there. It's a big deal, and it's big news, and it's really important. Before introducing the panelists, a few process issues for tonight and how we're going to make this evening work best. We have a lot of people, a lot of questions, but what we're going to do is ask each of our three panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute, to spend 15 or 20 minutes on what they want to bring to us on their subject matter. And we're not going to interrupt them with questions during this time, okay? We want to get through the information. On the chairs, on half of the chairs anyway, you'll find little cards and some pencils or pens. If something comes up during the presentation that you want to follow up on or ask more about, please write the questions down. And we're going to have people collecting them. You can pass them to the ends of the rows, or you'll see people walking around. After the presentations, I will do my best to moderate the questions. So I'll grab the questions and I'll read them, and we'll get through as many as we can, as fast as we can. That's the most efficient way we can do this. So thank you for that. We are videotaping this. I would ask you, please don't be tempted to take your own personal videos or pictures. We will use this video, make it available to everybody, make it available to those who weren't able to come tonight. We also have a number of local dignitaries, and I want to take this opportunity to introduce all of them. Please, I know you like to applaud for all of them. Wait till the end if you do, and I will introduce them. They can wave, they can stand, they can bow, they can do whatever, but we do have a great group here tonight. From the City Council, we have Mayor Kevin Ruane, we have Vice Mayor Mick Denham, we have Chauncey Goss, we have Jason Mon, we have Holly Smith, we have City Manager Judy Zamamra, and we have James Evans, obviously, who was one of the panelists. From the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, we have Rayanne Wessel, also on the panel. We have Ryan Orgera, who is the incoming CEO, and we have John Morse, the president of the Board of Trustees. We also, and we have a number of the board members of SCCF here as well. From Crow, we have Dr. Heather Barron, and we have Dr. Linda Estep. And from Fish, we have Maggie Feiner, president and CEO, and we also have our own Nicole McHale, who is the board chair. That's enough, Nicole, down now. From the Florida Economic Council, we have Richard Johnson, who's the board chair and founding member. And from the Sanibel Captiva Chamber of Commerce, we have John Lai, who is the president. Thanks to all of you who are here tonight. All right, we have three panelists, and we're very lucky to have them bring their wealth of expertise to this really important subject. First, we have Rayanne Wessel. Rayanne is a limnologist. Everybody knows what that is, right? Well, I had to look it up. Limnology is the study of inland aquatic ecosystems. And she's also a marine scientist with over 35 years of experience working in corporate, public, private, nonprofit sectors in Florida. And for the past 12 years, she's served as the Natural Resource Policy Director for SCCF, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. Her policy, advocacy, and outreach work brings sound scientific grounding to policy development, protection, and restoration of water resources, critical habitats, land management, and fish and wildlife conservation. She has been actively engaged in Everglades and Caloosahatchee restoration issues for the past 24 years. So thank you, Rayanne. We also have James Evans. James is the Director of Natural Resources for the city of Sanibel, where he has worked as a biologist and a resource manager for the past 18 years. James earned his Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and his Master's in Environmental Science, both from Florida Gulf Coast University. And as his graduate research project was the investigation and influence of freshwater inflow on fish and invertebrates in Estero Bay, pretty topical. Most recently, James authored the Caloosahatchee Watershed Regional Water Management Issues White Paper, a document outlining short and long-term strategies to address the freshwater discharges from Lake Okeechobee and the Caloosahatchee watershed. And finally, we have Sanibel Mayor Kevin Ruane. Mayor Ruane is currently serving his 8th consecutive term as mayor, and he was again elected to the City Council in 2017. Among his many responsibilities and duties, Mayor Ruane is the first vice president for the Florida League of Mayors Board of Directors. He serves on the Florida League of Cities Mayors Roundtable and is the chairman for the Lee County Coalition of Mayors. We should all be very proud that our mayor has such an important responsibility throughout Florida. He's also the 2016 recipient of the prestigious National Everglades Coalition James D. Webb Award. So, we have a great panel. We have an important subject. We have a wonderful crowd. Before I turn it over to Rayanne, I would like to thank Ken and the sanctuary staff for making this happen. It's great that the sanctuary... It's great for the sanctuary to be a leader on this really important issue. So with that, I will invite Rayanne to the panel.
I know, I'm only 5'2", so you really can't see me unless I stand up. I hear you, Tony. The voice from beyond. Well, thank you all for being here and for your interest in water quality. Thank you to the sanctuary for inviting us and encouraging this great turnout. My name is Rayanne Wessel, and I'll be talking about the big picture to give you some context tonight about how our waters locally are connected through the Caloosahatchee and the Everglades into this much bigger, greater Everglades ecosystem. James will then take over and talk about some of the projects that are solutions to how we're going to deal with some of the challenges that we have in restoration. And then the mayor will help bring it all home with the policy initiatives that he has been working on at the city, state, and federal levels. So without further ado, we'll jump right in with the story of the Everglades and Caloosahatchee. So many of you probably know that the greater Everglades ecosystem starts up in Orlando, just outside of Orlando at a place called Shingle Creek. The water in the highlighted area is the watershed. It consists of 16 counties today that connect down from Orlando through the Kissimmee Valley into Lake Okeechobee, through the lake and into the Everglades. Historically, on the right-hand side, that's how the water flowed. It all came from north to south. A drop of water up near Orlando would take 6 to 8 months to make it into Lake Okeechobee. And that's because there's a 40-foot fall of elevation from the top of the watershed to Lake Okeechobee. But that same drop of water coming out of Lake Okeechobee would take about 16 months to make it almost the same distance south out through the Everglades to Florida Bay. And that's because it gets very flat in the Everglades. So the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas discussion and naming of the river of grass was really because this very gentle slope just slowly moved water to the south. That's important to understand because when we hear the terms drain the swamp, we recognize that this didn't come up recently. It was the fundamental point that the man running for governor in 1904 here in Florida, that was his whole premise, was draining the swamp, getting rid of that Everglades, which was a worthless swamp. And in the process of time, that idea grew, and as you can see from 1911 through 1970, we just slowly worked our way, channelizing water away, not understanding the real value of wetlands and the water quality and the water supply that they were offering. It was really a problem to be gotten rid of. And all of this changes in the 1920s. There were two devastating hurricanes, 1926 and 1928, that hit Lake Okeechobee. And Lake Okeechobee had no formalized dike around it like it does today. It was hit with all the force of the kinds of winds that we see with hurricanes today. And that devastated the communities that were living all around the lake. Granted, there were not as many as we have today, but it was significant for the time. And because this was following a big flood in the 20s that preceded these two hurricanes, the state of Florida realized they had a problem and they needed help. So this is how the state-federal partnership gets forged, with the state asking the federal government, please help, we have a flood control problem. And in 1930, we start the Herbert Hoover Dike Project, which was the formal federal engineering project that was going to secure our landscape by putting a big dike around a wild lake. So what you see here on the upper slide is the lake as it existed pre-man's other idea. It would rise and spread out across the landscape and get a lot bigger to the green areas that you see, rising as high as 24 feet in the landscape. As the dry season would come, it would reduce down and you'd have a much smaller lake. But all of that deposition of good, healthy nutrients and the muck soils made that very attractive to growing winter vegetables. So by the time we decide to build this dike around Lake Okeechobee, we now have contained the lake. It can't spread out, and we're trying to contain it behind an artificially engineered dike that doesn't really have the capability to manage the same amount of water. So today, we manage water between 15.5 and 12.5 feet, a big difference from that original design. And what we end up with today, then, is what I call the Everglades squeeze. Now, that on Valentine's Day, that might sound like a good thing, but not in terms of our landscape. So the area outlined in red is the Everglades agricultural area, 700,000 acres of land where the water used to come flowing out of Lake Okeechobee to get into Everglades and into Florida Bay, is now, because there's a dike around the lake, that water no longer flows that direction. It's been co-opted with farming so that we only deliver water that is for irrigation today. The other half of the story is along the East Coast, Miami-Dade, Fort Lauderdale, and West Palm Beach. These two squeeze efforts have come to leave us with just half the Everglades that Mother Nature had designed. So these WCA 1, 2, 3 is what we have left of the historic Everglades. So the challenge we have is that we've lost over half of the Everglades. We're trying to do more with less, but because we've interrupted Mother Nature's design and we've channelized connections, water gets into the lake faster, into places, into the estuaries faster. It doesn't have the treatment that those marshes and Everglades systems provided at one time, so dirtier water is getting to all those destinations, whether it's Lake Okeechobee or our coastal watershed or other places like Florida Bay. With the dike around the lake, the flow is redirected so that all that water that used to go south into the Everglades is now directed solely to the west coast, where we get 70 to 80% of the excess water, or to the east coast, the St. Lucie, where they get about 24% of the excess water. Our river and watershed are about twice the size of the St. Lucie, just as a point of contact. So the big challenge we have is regaining storage that was lost, because until we can capture these frog strangler rains that come in big doses and hold it, treat it, and deliver it in a friendly timing, we're going to be damaging our natural resources. So going from that bigger picture of the Everglades to the Caloosahatchee, Many people don't realize that the Caloosahatchee was never directly connected to Lake Okeechobee. The Western Everglades wrapped around the western side of Lake Okeechobee, and a series of lakes were part of that marsh or that Western Everglades. And when water would get really high, 24 feet in the lake, some of that water would come to the west, just a little bit of it. Most of it still went south. It went through those marshes and those 11,000 acres of lakes, the 4 different lakes. And when it got to the western edge, here, it met a geologic rise. So there was actually a waterfall that delivered water to the Caloosahatchee proper. That changes with the Diston era. Hamilton Diston made a deal with the state, another governor, and said, I'll get rid of some of that swampland that you are so unpopular around here. And so he brought in a dredge that worked its way down from the upper chain of lakes up near Orlando and connected through the Kissimmee Valley, connected all these natural lakes that had been isolated into Lake Okeechobee, and also made the first connection to Lake Okeechobee as a navigable channel and dynamited the waterfalls. That delivered a lot more water, a lot faster, and it started flooding the communities of LaBelle and Alva and Fort Myers. I love this image because this is the best demonstration I have found. The blue outline, that squiggly line, is the original Caloosahatchee. This is a plat of LaBelle. And the dark streak behind it is what the channelization did to straighten out the river, because you can move a whole lot more water faster if you have straight lines. Engineers know this. And so we did it twice. We had another set of hurricanes, another set of floods, and so the Caloosahatchee has actually been dredged twice. So today, instead of this twisting, winding, crooked river that we once had, we have 3 lock and dam structures from right at the lake, one at Ortona, and one at Franklin. This is in East Lee County in estuary on this side, and the freshwater Caloosahatchee upstream. And what that's left us with is what I coined a term called the Goldilocks principle. Because our poor river and estuary tend to go from one extreme of way too much water to another extreme of not enough water. And we're left with these examples where there's harm at both extremes. So what we'd like to do is just get a little closer to just right. We're not asking for perfect, but wouldn't mind if we got there for a period of time. Whoops. So this is the, how many of you were here 2005? That was the big event that we had where water for months was coming out through these barrier islands out into the Gulf 25 miles. When that happens, that means fresh water is pushing the nursery of the estuary out into the open Gulf, and you lose all those year class of fish. There's no nursery for estuarine species out there. This was June of 2005. Just 3 years later, in June of 2008, we had started a 7-year drought. And this is the Franklin Lock we just looked at. That green stuff you see is a toxic blue-green algae bloom, like we've had this year, a cyanobacteria bloom. And it is being held back behind the lock because there's not enough water, fresh water, coming in, being delivered by the Water Management District from Lake Okeechobee, and there's no water coming from the landscape because it's not raining, we're in a drought. And so the only place that water can go by gravity is ultimately here to our backyard in the estuary. But this is a harmful condition for anything trying to live in those waters as well. So this is our Goldilocks principle of too much and too little. So where does the water come from? Well, another piece of information that I think is very valuable, I hope you'll enjoy learning, is that we blame a lot on Lake Okeechobee, which is 730 square miles. You can see it outlined there. But it turns out that the area that feeds into our 75-mile-long river is almost 2 Lake Okeechobees in size. So our watershed, or that area in pink that you see, is almost 2 Lake Okeechobees in size. And this area is very flashy. It means when it rains in LaBelle and Alva and Moorhaven, it comes into the river really quickly. Whereas the lake at least captures water and it can be photo-bleached. But this is one of the dynamics to understand that it's not always a problem with Lake Okeechobee water. Sometimes it's our watershed that's delivering harmful flows. And of course, when we get too much water, this is a far too familiar scene. The Caloosahatchee turns, looks like latex paint, or St. Patty's Day has arrived early. It's not, but it's like latex paint on everything. Cuts the light, it takes up the oxygen, and even down here at the refuge, that nutrient inflow feeds algal blooms that impact fish and wildlife, birds, and everything that we like to do here. By contrast, when we don't have enough water and we're in a dry season, we have the problem we have is that the impact of salt water coming from the Gulf into the river system extends way too far upstream. This is an example up in Alva by the lock, where in August of 2010 you see this lush grass bed. This is a freshwater grass bed. You'll hear us talk about Vallisneria or water celery. By December, just a few months later, at that same location, it was completely devastated. This grass needs salinities, saltiness of about 5 to 10 at maximum levels. We have salinities up to 22 parts that are killing this off. And when that happens, you're losing the grass that holds the soil in place, that absorbs the nutrients, that keeps those sediments from refluxing nutrients into the water column. So they're actually preventing, in addition to being great habitat and necessary habitat, they're keeping the water quality, Mother Nature's way of providing this for free. And a number of species depend on it. And so we have the volume challenges with water, too much, too little, but we also have the water quality. It has become far too impactful this year. And I do want to point out one thing about Lake Okeechobee and the living system of the marsh. This area in yellow that you see outlined is inside the dike. That is the marsh. That's the living system. That's what breeds all the fish that make it a landmark place to recreate. It's what cleans the water. And it just so happens that the Caloosahatchee, being right here, gets the benefit of all of that filtering, which is why sometimes the water quality coming to us from the lake is better quality than what the poor St. Lucie gets that has no marsh. It has a deep part of the lake right in front of it. So just the point that, these natural systems are delivering services for free that we would otherwise have to engineer and build and figure out how to operate. This is this year's algal bloom from space. I don't know if it shows up very well in the back of the room, but there is an algal bloom over about 60% of the lake at this point. The Caloosahatchee is down here. The St. Lucie is there. Caloosahatchee is actually right here. So this is the marsh inside the lake that's filtering it. But still, that water had two places to come, to the two estuaries. It doesn't go south, except for irrigation water. So that's what started in June, that big toxic algal bloom that we had until very recently. Down at the Gulf side, of course, we had another event that was extreme, and that is the red tide. It's in abatement right now, although north of us there's a real hot spot, so if we can keep the Sarasota, Tampa Bay area from flowing this way. The problem is it turns the water a color that you might have noticed, but even before that you'll get the sensation of irritation in your sinuses and your throat, and you can see the discoloration from here. We lost over 2,200 tons of marine life this year. That's county-wide, and I think the mayor might have new updates, but 425 tons of dead marine life were on Sanibel alone. Just to give you some context, an African elephant is 1 ton. It affects everything. But we know what the causes and solutions are to a number of these things, and Everglades restoration is a big part of that. So I'm going to turn it over to James and let him explain. This is the 30-year program called Central Everglades Restoration Project. That's a state-federal cost share, 50-50 partnership. And it started back when they built the dike around Lake Okeechobee. I think that's it, right?
Thanks, Ryan. I got to move the mic up a little bit.
Oh, come on.
I get to say that.
So I want to thank you all for inviting me to speak to you tonight. Obviously, it's an important topic, and glad to see how many people turned out for it. It's been pretty stressful times for the city during this event, which started really for us in May when we started to see the blue-green algae blooms creeping into the Caloosahatchee, and then obviously transitioning into a red tide bloom, which Rayanne talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more about the impacts later in the presentation. But the city of Sanibel has been engaged in this issue for quite a long time. It's not just when the water's poor, it's when the water's good, because you don't hear from the public when the water looks nice, and of course the water's blue-green, and people are happy, and your beaches are full, and everybody's paying for beach parking, and everything's great. But when you have an event like we just had, or we continue to have, people don't come, and the businesses are impacted. And really, thank your city council, because they have really been the leaders, not only here on Sanibel, but for the entire region. Statewide, the mayor, now being the president-elect of the Florida League of Mayors, has an opportunity to really lead statewide. So it's going to be an important issue for this election. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of the projects. But back in 2016, we put together what's called the Caloosahatchee Regional Water Management Issues White Paper. And what it did was essentially laid out a strategy for what we wanted to advocate for when it comes to projects and policies and things that would help improve our water quality. And the focus was really the same issues that we're working on to restore the Everglades, and that's to restore the quantity, quality, timing, and distribution of the freshwater flows to the Caloosahatchee. But in the context of the Everglades is, of course, to move that water south, cleaner than it is currently, and make sure it's delivered to the Everglades so we can kind of restore the timing of what, and the flows that used to historically go to the Everglades, which Ryan just talked about. But there are some things that we can do short term, which are primarily policy changes. Long term, there's a number of very large infrastructure projects that I'll talk about. And they're part of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, and some of them are not. But I'll differentiate which projects are and which ones aren't. And there's a real need for additional storage, treatment, and conveyance. And we want to convey as much of that water south as possible. But as Rayanne indicated, we also need some of that water during the dry season. So we need to make sure that we're storing that water within our own watershed, so that water is delivered to the Caloosahatchee when we actually need it during the dry season to prevent those blue-green algae blooms that occur east of the Franklin Lock, and also the impacts of salinity to the organisms that depend on that estuarine habitat. And we also want to, we really need to start to improve our stormwater management, and that doesn't just include the areas east of the Franklin Lock, that includes areas within our own county. As you start to see development running rampant throughout the county, you're also seeing a lot of stormwater runoff, and that water is getting into our own watershed within the tidal basin untreated as well. So we really need to be advocates not only regionally, but also in our own backyards. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we're doing here on Sanibel. We also need to enforce water quality standards, and that of course, is a state responsibility. And we really need to push our state agencies to make sure that water quality is enforced, and that they understand that we as citizens want that enforced, because it does protect our economy. And finally, we do need to do more comprehensive land use planning. Sanibel has a Sanibel plan, and we're very proud of that. And it puts conservation or habitat, it puts wildlife and wildlife habitat at the top of the hierarchy of values, and that really helps us protect our water quality. And you all should be very proud of the Sanibel plan and what it's doing for our community as we move forward and protect water quality in our own backyards. But some of the projects I want to talk about regionally are really ones that are associated with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And the goal of Everglades restoration, of course, is to not restore the historic flows, but to restore them to flows that will help sustain the Everglades and protect the northern estuaries. And when I talk about the northern estuaries, I'm talking about the Caloosahatchee estuary to the west and the St. Lucie to the east. Here's an image that shows the historic flows from the Everglades that Rayanne referred to. This is the current flows. You can see the ditch and drain system from the Kissimmee chain of lakes all the way down into the Everglades. This is the flow that we're trying to achieve with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. It's not perfect, but it'll be better than what we have right now. And it should reduce ultimately the flows to the Caloosahatchee by about 80%, the harmful flows, and should restore the beneficial flows pretty significantly as well. Some of the Everglades projects that I'll be talking about will be the Kissimmee River Restoration Project, storage and treatment north of Lake Okeechobee. Obviously, storing more water and holding more water and treating it before it gets into the lake is beneficial. The Herbert Hoover Dike rehabilitation, the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule, the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, which is south of Lake Okeechobee, and the Central Everglades project. We'll be talking about the Tamiami Trail bridging, the C-111 South Dade project, and the C-43 West Basin Storage Reservoir, and some of the components of that project. So this very complicated chart you see here is what we refer to as the integrated delivery schedule. And that's the schedule that the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management District and other agencies that all work together on Everglades restoration to plan projects. And it includes a number of projects, as you can see. And what's important to note about this is that the timing of the different projects, the implementation timing of the projects depend on one another. So some projects have to precede other projects. And that's really important because until we get certain projects done, we can't move forward to get the benefits of the future projects. And there's a number of projects that we're working on today. And of course, when you look at Everglades restoration, just to understand the magnitude of this restoration project, it's a $13 to $16 billion project just for the state of Florida. So we're competing with funds from other states that would also like funding for environmental restoration projects as well. And we've taken the lion's share of that funding for a number of years, and people are getting burnt out. So it's critical that we get these projects done in a timely manner. And so this is the Kissimmee restoration. It's not a comprehensive Everglades restoration plan project, but it's a project that started back in 1999, restoration began. But what's interesting about this project is back in, I believe it was 1947, some flooding that was occurring. The river historically, I believe it was about 140 miles long, meandered from south of Shingle Creek all the way down to Lake Okeechobee. And during that time, it had a floodplain that extended out about 3 miles. And that's a tremendously large area north of Lake Okeechobee. And what the Army Corps of Engineers was brought in to do in 1948, when the Central and South Florida project was authorized, was to come in here and straighten the Kissimmee, get rid of the oxbows, the meanders, and get the water to Lake Okeechobee to prevent flooding north of the lake. And unfortunately, the Army Corps of Engineers are really good engineers. They do a very good job, and that water did exactly what it was supposed to. It got into the lake very quickly, but there were a number of unintended consequences, and that resulted in a lot of impacts to the ecology north of Lake Okeechobee, and it also resulted in some flooding in Lake Okeechobee, and of course the damage to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie estuaries. So, as a result, in 1999, they began the Kissimmee River Restoration, and that project's slated to be completed in around 2020. And that's going to provide a lot of storage and treatment, or at least some. It restores about 40 or so miles of the historic 103 miles of the Kissimmee River. And so another project that we're working on north of Lake Okeechobee is the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Project. That project's kind of in limbo right now, but the goal of that project was to add additional storage and treatment north of Lake Okeechobee so that we could slow that water down before it gets into the lake and treat it. And then, of course, the water coming into the lake would be cleaner, and we wouldn't have to spend as much time treating it before it goes either to the estuaries or south into Lake Okeechobee and ultimately into Everglades National Park and Florida Bay. The Herbert Hoover Dike project is an important project. It's a public safety project, and I want to make sure that everyone in the audience understands that the intention of the Herbert Hoover Dike restoration, it'll restore about 147 miles of of dike around Lake Okeechobee. And the goal of that is to protect the communities that are around Lake Okeechobee. The goal is not to hold more water in the lake, although it will provide an opportunity for the Army Corps of Engineers to have a little bit of what we call operational flexibility. So they don't have to discharge that water as quickly to the coast or south. Gives them a little bit of time to figure out where to send that water. But again, what's important about this project is it'll take the pressure away from having to discharge that water immediately to the coast, but the goal is not to hold stack water in the lake, because ultimately the estuaries will get that water if we hold more water in the lake. The next thing I want to talk about is the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule. And the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule is the schedule that the Army Corps of Engineers uses to regulate water discharges from Lake Okeechobee. And the goal is to manage water levels between 12.5 and 15.5 feet. And in that lake schedule, when you get into the higher bands of the Lake Okeechobee schedule, it calls for discharges to the estuaries. And I'll just note, just so you all know, the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule really sends the lion's share of the water to the Caloosahatchee when we get into these higher bands, obviously because we have higher capacity, as Rayanne indicated. But when we're in the lower bands, the Lake Okeechobee specifies a certain amount that can be sent to the Caloosahatchee for dry season flows. And unfortunately, it does not send enough water during the dry season to maintain salinities in the appropriate range, and that's one of the reasons why the city of Sanibel, along with a number of other cities in Lee County, are challenging the South Florida Water Management District for what's called the minimum flow and level rule. And that challenge is meant to make sure that we get the minimum amount of water that will prevent further harm to the estuary during dry periods. So the regulation schedule that is going to start an update in 2019 will incorporate some of that information. And that's why it's so critical that the city of Sanibel and the cities of Lee County challenge this rule, so that when we set the basement levels of water that go to the estuary, we want to make sure that that level is not a standard that will always impact the estuary. We want to make sure that if we set what's called a significant harm standard, that we can achieve those standards and that we prevent significant harm from occurring. So I just wanted to point that out. As you can see from the graph as well as the flow chart to the right, lower bottom right there, it's a pretty complex schedule. And we're on a weekly call with the Army Corps of Engineers in the South Florida Water Management District, and we make weekly recommendations. Rayanne, as well as others from the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation Marine Lab, participate in that call, and we make recommendations. We make those recommendations based on science, and we produce a weekly report that is available on the SWFL website. So another project that is a high priority for the city of Sanibel, as well as others, is the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir. That is a project that was authorized by the state of Florida, I believe, a year and a half, 2 years ago. Senator Joe Negron was a champion of that project, and that actually was just approved by the Senate a few weeks ago. And just recently, the worded bill was actually signed into law, which authorizes the EAA reservoir to move forward. That's going to provide about 40 to 60% relief of the high flow discharges from Lake Okeechobee to the Caloosahatchee once that's constructed. We're still about 10 years out, so don't get too excited. But that project's about $1.4 billion project. It's a 50-50 cost share between the state of Florida and the federal government. So the next step will be for our council and our partners here at the city of Sanibel, at SCCF and Ding Darling, will be to advocate for appropriations for those funds. So we have a lot of work to do in the next couple of years. Hopefully we can get those appropriations in the next year or so. So that's one of our primary goals. Another project that's really important is the Tamiami Trail bridging. Currently, in 2013, we finished 1 mile bridge. 2.6 miles of bridge is currently under construction, and that should be finished here pretty soon. And there's another 5 miles or so that are planned. And so what that does is helps eliminate some of the impediments to moving water south. If we don't have the infrastructure or the conveyance, we can't move that water south, even if we have storage reservoirs. south of Lake Okeechobee or north of Lake Okeechobee. So it's critical that we get the infrastructure in place to be able to convey that water south. And I also want to mention another project that's the C111 South Dade project, and that's a project that helps us restore flows to the Eastern Everglades National Park as well as Taylor Slough. And that'll allow us to move additional water south. Once we can get it south of Lake Okeechobee, store it in the reservoir, and move it through some of the Central Everglades projects, that will help us move additional water into Taylor Slough and ultimately into Florida Bay. So all of these projects really complement one another, and it's critical that you guys understand that. And it's not just one project that solves all of our issues. There are no silver bullets in the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. But the EA Reservoir is one of those projects that's critical to our issues here in the Caloosahatchee. And the last project I'm really going to talk about here in the regional arena is the C43 West Basin Reservoir Project. And that's a project that's located in Hendry County. It's on about 10,000 acres of land. It'll store about 170,000 acre-feet of water. And just to put an acre-foot in perspective, that's about a football field of water flooded about a foot deep. So figure about 170,000 of those, and that's the C43 reservoir. And that only makes up about 30% of the water we need to store within the Caloosahatchee watershed. As Rayanne indicated, our watershed's about 865,000 acres. It's a huge watershed. But because of all the land use changes that have occurred, mostly agricultural land use changes, we've lost most of that storage. So we need to store about 450,000 acre-feet of water within the watershed to be able to restore those flows to the Caloosahatchee and not have those high flow discharges and those low flow events where we don't have enough fresh water to balance the salinity. So the reservoir really is a low flow project. It's going to provide those flows during the dry season that we need. It's really not going to do much on the high flow end. It's not going to capture a lot of water and prevent those high flow discharges. It will capture some, but it's really designed to provide those dry season flows. So just so you understand that what it will do and what it won't do, because it's been sold as different things by different people. But currently, it does not have a water quality treatment component, and one of the City Council's goals, and we've identified in the white paper, is to put in a water quality treatment component for that project so that the water we get that comes into the reservoir comes out cleaner than it goes in. And as you all know, the water going into the Caloosahatchee is not exactly clean when it comes to water quality standards, and we need to make sure that changes with a water quality treatment component for the reservoir. And I mentioned the rule change that the South Florida Water Management District is currently proposing an update to the minimum flow and level rule. We have a hearing scheduled for Monday and Tuesday of next week, so I'm not going to really talk about the details of that, but your city council, along with a number of the other cities in Lee County, all of them actually, have been a party to challenging the district in this rule. And I think it's a really good cause, and hopefully we'll win that challenge. But we'll see on Monday and Tuesday. And I also want to just comment that the Marine Lab and the SECF, as well as Ding Darling, have been an intricate part of this rule challenge. And we couldn't do it without our partners here in Sanibel. So appreciate everything they've done, and we've been able to do, and the support that we've gotten from the community on this rule challenge. Recently, the cost estimates for the C43 reservoir, which is the actual recovery strategy for the minimum flow and level rule, have come in about 350 to 400 million above budget. The project was estimated at about 600 million. So we're looking at a 50–60% increase in the total project costs. So that concerns us. Another reason why I think it was a good call that we challenged the rule, because if the recovery strategy isn't completed, we don't get the flows we need, because we don't have to implement the recovery strategy until this project's completed. So it's an important component of this whole rule challenge. So when we start to look at the state's responsibility when it comes to water quality, they've been delegated by the federal government under the Clean Water Act to protect our water quality here in the state of Florida. And based on what we're seeing here in some of these images, that starting in, I believe, in July, you'll see the blue-green algae blooms that covered the Caloosahatchee, pretty much covered the entire 70-plus miles of the Caloosahatchee. I did an aerial tour with the mayor and flew the Caloosahatchee, and we saw blue-green algae in every stretch of the river from the estuary all the way to the Franklin Lock. The Moorhaven Lock, and actually we could see the flow of blue-green algae coming out of Lake Okeechobee. So it was clearly coming from Lake Okeechobee. But what we're doing in our own watershed is exacerbating the problem because the nutrients that come off of our landscapes are feeding these blooms. So it's not just what's coming from Lake Okeechobee, it's also what's coming from the watershed. But these images, show you some of the canals in Cape Coral that were covered with blue-green algae for a number of months throughout the summer. The image on the upper right, right here is an image of Mayor Kevin Ruane and Councilwoman Holly Smith with Lieutenant Colonel Reynolds from the Army Corps of Engineers talking about the impact that the red tide blooms were having on on Sanibel at the time. Of course, we picked up about 430 tons of marine life from our beaches alone, which had a huge economic impact, which I'll leave for the mayor to talk about. We had a whale shark that washed up on the beach at the beginning of the red tide bloom. And at the same time, we were seeing some blue-green algae blooms washing into our canals. So it wasn't a pretty picture this summer. If you weren't here, be lucky you weren't here to see it. But fortunately, we may be out of the woods right now, especially with the blue-green algae because it's mostly temperature dependent. But the red tide isn't, and the red tide can arrive and come back at any time. So just because it's not here today doesn't mean it won't be here tomorrow. I just want to talk about a couple, finally just talk about a couple of local projects that are priorities for the city of Sanibel that we're working on currently, one of which is the Jordan Marsh Water Quality Treatment Park. This is a project that's, that we're working on right now. It's located off Cassie Bell Road, near Periwinkle and Cassie Bell Road. It's on a tract of land that's conservation land that's owned by the city of Sanibel, about 6 acres, and a fraction of the Bob Wigley Preserve, which is owned by the SWFL, and we're partners on this project. And the goal of this project is actually to create a filter marsh to pull water from the Sanibel River, treat that water, and put it back in the river cleaner than it came out. And the Sanibel River is currently impaired for nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. So we're not doing a great job of treating our nutrients in our own backyard, but we're working really hard to do that. And it's the legacy nutrients that have been going into the Sanibel Slough. We also refer to it as the Sanibel River over decades from septic and discharges from the old wastewater treatment package plants that got into the river. And now it's our job to treat and clean that water up and make sure that the Sanibel River moving forward meets water quality standards. This is one of the projects that will help us do that. This project will remove about 38% of the total nitrogen required by the what's called the total maximum daily load. That's the nutrient criteria established by the Florida Department of Environmental Protection for the Sanibel Slough, and it'll remove about 21% of the total phosphorus. So that's a pretty good reduction for one project. And here's an image of it taken. This was a drone image, a composite drone image using some 3D technology. And you can see it's located off Cassie Bell Road here. And we should be done with the project sometime mid to late December. So the project's moving along really well. And it's going to have public access. We're going to have some trails and some recreational opportunities out there. And it's also going to enhance the wildlife habitat for wading birds and other wildlife at the park. So we're really excited about the project. And one of the last projects I'm going to talk about is the Donax Water Reclamation Facility. This is a project that will help us remove the nitrogen and phosphorus from the reuse water that is sent to the golf courses. They're the primary users of reuse water on Sanibel. The sanctuary uses a lot of reuse water as well as the community. And a lot of the condominiums along West Gulf and some other select properties use reuse water. And what we found as part of the comprehensive nutrient management plan that we worked with the SCCF Marine Lab to develop was that a large amount of the loading to the Sanibel Slough is actually coming from the reuse water. And the reuse water has high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus in it. And we found that through a process of denitrification and other processes in the wastewater treatment plants, that we would be able to remove a much higher amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. And And the City Council has made this a #1 priority. This project was estimated somewhere around, I think, $11 million originally. The bids came in significantly higher than that, so we're looking at some opportunities for some value engineering. But this particular project will remove about 50% of the phosphorus and about 70% of the nitrogen from the reuse water. That's a pretty significant reduction. And when we look at how it relates to the Sanibel Slough, it will remove about 53% of the phosphorus loading target established by the DEP for the eastern slough, and about 75% of the nitrogen for the eastern slough. And for the western slough, and when I talk about these, the locations, I'm talking about east of Tarpon Bay is the east slough, and west of Tarpon Bay Road would be the west slough. And for the west slough, it's about 50% of the total phosphorus and about 43% of the total nitrogen. So for one project, granted it's an expensive project, it has a pretty significant reduction in the load. So that's why it's a priority project for City Council, and we're moving forward with that project at this time. And just so you all know, the design and engineering has been completed, and we're looking at the bids now. So, and the last project I just want to talk about, and this is a project that has an impact in your own backyards. It's the Sanibel Communities for Clean Water program. It's a program that was established to essentially educate homeowners such as yourselves about the impact that you have in your own backyards from fertilizer runoff and the things that you do, whether it's the use of reuse water or fertilizer. Those things impact water quality in your stormwater lakes, your canals, and the Sanibel Slough. And we, working with the SWF Marine Lab, were able to sample over 70 water bodies. Each water body was ranked according to its water quality standards based on wet season, dry season samples. And that data was incorporated into a user-friendly interactive website. And you can access that by going to sanibelcleanwater.org. And we have links to from the city website as well. And you can find your community. You'll notice that Lake 4 of the sanctuary is located here on the lower left-hand side. Oops, sorry. And they're ranked at about 14 out of 72. So, you know, there's some things they can work on. And what we did was we provided the data where they rank according to state standards, where they rank with the Sanibel average. So put into context how you know, your water body is doing compared to others. Hopefully it'll instill some sense of competition among the communities. And we also provided some helpful best management practices that we felt tailored specifically to your community would be helpful. For example, the reuse water calculator. Because your community uses reuse water, you want to calculate how much nutrients is coming in from the reuse water, and you can deduct that from the amount of nutrients you need to put on the landscape to make sure that your grass and turf grass is healthy. Some of the other things we've looked at are mechanically removing algae from the lakes, checking your irrigation and making sure that that's not getting into the lakes, and reassessing your fertilizer practices. So those are some of the things that you can look at. We think it's going to be a very successful program. I'd encourage you, if you haven't been to that site, take a look and see where your water bodies rank. And if you have any questions, you can always give us a call at the City of Sanibel. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mayor to talk about some of the city's priorities.
Thanks, James. I appreciate it. Good evening. Thanks for having me. First, I obviously need to recognize my entire council. Jason Mons in the back, Chauncey Goss, Nick Denham, and Councilwoman Smith. Together, all of us really work in conjunction for you, our residents. I can tell you, when I got into this job, I never thought I'd be going to Washington, never thought I'd be going to Tallahassee nearly as frequently as I have. But recognizing that all these projects that James alluded to really cost an awful lot of money. So what's the strategy in doing this? How do we go up there and kind of talk about the things that might make some sense in Washington? And these days, there's not a lot of things that make sense up there. And it's really been a challenge, to say the least. But when you look at the various things that we're talking about, we really break down this issue to quality and quantity. Quality really talks about us walking the walk and talking the talk, doing things in our own backyard, and even the projects we try to do at home, from obviously our founding fathers coming up with a sewer system that cost an awful lot of money, continue to do the things we're talking about and doing. The Donuts water facility that we're trying to obviously accomplish, as James alluded to, came in with budgets significantly higher than the $11 to $12 million we had anticipated. We had already gotten over $2.8 million from the state. Both Councilwoman Smith and Mick Denham just recently this last year were up in Tallahassee, obviously advocating, certainly our other council members, but they were out advocating for the dollars and cents. We received over $2 million. So again, anytime we have an opportunity to do local projects and we obviously have an opportunity to receive money from the state, it's really our responsibility to do so. It lessens the tax burden on you. It obviously continues to obviously walk the walk on really clean water, what we're trying to do. So that was really important. Below that was obviously the Jordan Marsh treatment. Again, when you talk about water quality, we want to continue to talk about things that we're going to do in our own backyard. That again was another opportunity to advocate for money. We received money from the Water Management District for that project. But again, between the two projects, both the Donex treatment plant as well as Jordan Marsh, it's over $3 million that we were able to receive advocating for that. As James alluded to earlier, we're going to be back up this year to Tallahassee because the project for the Donex plant has obviously come in significantly higher. So to obviously reduce your burden, we'll go up and continue to advocate for the project. The good news is having only received about $2.8 million on a $12 million project, it's only a little over 20%. As the project cost went up, obviously that is lower. There's always opportunities to receive as much as 50% in any type of cost sharing situation. So again, you look at opportunities to advocate for what you can do in those regards. It's consistent to try to look at what we can do in our own backyard. The Vice Mayor, certainly Vice Mayor Denham, has gone around to the county in many of the cities to really have the same walk the walk, talk the talk. It's important to do so because in Lee County we're looked at. We continue to want to make sure we clean our own backyard up first because again, if we could obviously have good, clean quality of water, what we can do is an advocate obviously for quantity projects. When you look at a number at $16 billion, it's an awful lot of money, but we start to work with, and by extension, I was able to get involved in the Florida League of Mayors. There's 39 mayors, and this past year I was elected to president-elect. We were able to enable that group to make water quality the #1 priority. Back in 2016, I was able to have 163 mayors from the 16 counties that James talked about sign the largest compact ever. And honestly, that was one of the key ingredients, in my opinion, of getting the water bill passed for the Storage South. Many groups were involved in that, but again, when you talk about water quality, it's important that you do the things in your own backyard and you indicate when we're asking for funds why it's so important. The things that we do, it's easier to ask for money when we're walking the walk and talking the talk. And when you talk about some of the projects we're talking about, the next one you look at is the EAA storage. That's a $1.3 to $1.6 billion project. It's important. And this past summer, I had the privilege of going to Washington with Councilwoman Smith, and we went around anticipating that bill to be passed. But we went one step further, and I can't thank Congressman Rooney enough. Congressman Rooney was instrumental in making appointments for us, literally with key people in appropriations. We already were past the point of we thought the bill would pass. We were talking about how do we get money. Because the funny thing in Washington is you pass a bill and it has no money attached to it. So then you got to go back and ask for money. So again, in anticipation of that, both Councilwoman Smith and myself were in Washington meeting with various people. But Congressman Rooney was actually enabling us to meet with the chair of appropriations. You don't walk into Washington and obviously sit with congressmen as long as we did. And we were constantly running behind appointments because the congressmen were asking us. If anything I learned in all the times I've been up to Washington, you go in there, you speak for 3 or 5 minutes, you make your pitch, and you get out. We're there for 15 and 20 and 25 minutes, and the congressmen keep us there. I mean, I've never experienced that in my life. I mean, as long as I've been on council, I've been involved in many things. Been to testify before Congress, but never had an opportunity to say, can you call the next congressman because this congressman made me late for the next appointment. We ran around, the summer, obviously as we were dealing with many issues here, but that project obviously for storage, treatment and conveyance south is probably the most important when you look at dollar for dollar and bang for your buck. That's the most important project we need to put on the books because that obviously takes care of our high flow issues and obviously when we have the rains that we do and the last 4 or 5 years have been what we call high flow issues that we've had. Too much rain, too quickly, and we need to do something with it. You know, the C-43 reservoir is another project that, you know, again, you come into overruns. Our local project certainly went over, but nothing to the degree that C-43 is. I mean, it's $400 million over budget on a $600 million project. And it doesn't even have a stormwater treatment component to it. So we need to get that in there as well. So some of the challenges that we have, so when we have an opportunity to talk about an MFL issue, it's why we felt really important to challenge some of the rules that were coming out from the Water Management District, because we obviously realized that the issue we have is we need water during the dry season. We don't want as much water during the wet season. So, you know, that project is really important. No different than the last two projects are important for us to continue to really look at storage and everything you can do. And obviously the dike, fortunately it was approved and fully funded. So that obviously project is about 50% along the way, and money is really important to do so. So as much as James and Rayanne would indicate, that is not really for more storage. When you have short-term situations, when you're waiting for, you know, the EAA South, and it's going to be 10 years, you know, to obviously have an opportunity to have some operational flexibilities, work within laws, and have an opportunity to advocate for some short-term relief, some operational flexibility. Can you hold a little bit more water? Because you don't have a project. There's not a project that you can put on the books quick enough to give you relief. So you look to these short-term policy situations that you have and continue to advocate for those. Knowing the situation, having someone as talented as Director Evans to continue to keep us up to date, because each one of us have particular assignments on council. We all do that, and James is really the person that gives us the science. All we really do is talk about advocacy. And we go to the various groups we have, and I can tell you, I've been at this game for now 12 years and trying to advocate. I've never seen a harder working council. I'm not just saying that because I'm sitting in front of you as people, but there's 5 people. We all talk about what we can do. We all have roles. We all continue to do what we do. It's really an honor to be part of this whole group to do the things that we do. But it's important as we have these opportunities for leadership positions to really talk about what we do in our own backyard and then continue to advocate for these things. Because no sense that we ran into these situations this summer. Last summer was a challenge, obviously, with the hurricane, but this summer was even more challenging. I'm certainly blessed to work with 5 other mayors in Lee County. We continue have had a bond of getting together as a group, and we were sitting in my office in Fort Myers, obviously as red tide was being impactful to our area, and said, okay, we need to do something. And they all turned to me and said, well, you know the governor, call him up. I'm like, okay. Call his office, and you know they answer the phone and say, okay, what's our issue? Well, we were dealing with blue-green algae at the moment, and that obviously is an algal bloom. But red tide was obviously something that was out there since last October, but this actually went into a different gear. One might advocate, or one might actually say one of the reasons that it got to as bad as it was is obviously the conditions we had and the releases we had and the watershed issues and the high nutrient loads we had were just fueling the red tide. It made it worse. So when you deal with 850,000 pounds, well, how do we clean it up? The first issue is how do we pay for it and have it not impact your tax dollars? So called the governor's office up and said, we need to have a state of emergency. So obviously the Office of Emergency Management walked me through the process and had to go to Lee County. And our entire council went with the 5 other mayors from the county. And we actually asked Lee County to actually make the declaration as a state of emergency. We did that, obviously, the first and foremost thing is to try to get funding necessary. The governor then made a second state of emergency based on our ask, and we have actually almost $1.7 million worth of bills associated with the red tide cleanup. I mean, think about 850,000 pounds of marine life that washed up on your shores. How do you deal with it? The first thing you need to do is obviously deal with the symptom. We've been working on, obviously, and trying to address the causes all throughout, but the symptom is it's on the beach. What do we do with it? We got to remove it. So we were fortunate to obviously get that allocation, get the funding, get the state of emergency declared, and then we did the same for our own community. It was important to do that to obviously allow our community to file the necessary claims with their insurance companies, to obviously do the declarations to any type of interruption, business interruption, any type of insurance they might have to do that. It just enabled them to do that. So I was very pleased that the governor did as quickly react to this situation. and obviously allocate funding for it. So it didn't have any impacts on our budget. It was a strained budget season last year because we went through a hurricane and spent almost $5 million in addressing just the cleanup efforts. So this catastrophe, faced with last year's catastrophe, just continued to drain cash flow. So it was really important for us to go through that process and understanding the devastation, because we talk about quality of life, we talk about the impacts obviously the tourism has, but obviously our real estate values. And again, I go back to working with the Florida League of Mayors, because they were able to compound information for me and talk about just how many cities are impacted by this. Because obviously water quality is really a direct impact to tourism and a direct impact to real estate values. When you look at the 163 cities that are involved, there's over $1.3 trillion in real estate values for those 163 cities. They are directly and indirectly affected by Lake Oak releases. When you talk about tourism in those 163 cities, there's over $700 million in tourism. So it's a $2 trillion project. So when we talk about advocacy, we talk about 16, obviously $1 billion. When you're talking about $2 trillion, 5% is $10 billion. 10% is $20 billion. Can we imagine real estate values going down by 10%? Yeah, we've seen that movie before. Okay, so obviously what we try to do is continue to advocate for these dollars and cents. And honestly, I can't thank the council enough just for what we do. And it's really just, okay, what do we have to do? Let's divide up the jobs, the responsibilities, and go out and do that. So, we're a very challenging year, these last 2 years, but certainly we were all up to the challenge, and certainly council enabled me to certainly do the things that were necessary in that capacity. We certainly just had a special workshop on what we can do and how we continue to refine what we are working on and how we continue to make sure we deal with water quality. And obviously that enables us to get the money for water quantity. And you have events like this. It was bad enough that we had to deal with red tide, but I couldn't imagine asking you all to increase your taxes because I had to deal with this issue. So fortunately, we were able to walk through that process. But those are my presentation for the areas I wanted to cover, make sure everyone understood what exactly the differences that we all have and the advocacy we all do. But I can't thank the council, the opportunity to be certainly the mayor, but certainly working with each one of you. It's really been a privilege, and honestly, I can't tell you how hard they work. They work unbelievably hard for it, so thank you.
All right, so that was pretty fantastic, and I appreciate your patience. You're wondering, what can you do now that you're empowered with all this great information? So both SCCF and the city have alert systems that we send out when there are timely notices, when we need letters written or something else. Just to give you an underscore, this C43 reservoir that we've been talking about, that started with Carla Johnson, Mayor Johnson. It took 10 years to break ground. The EAA reservoir has come into approvals within a year. It was fast-tracked. This is the difference between having your voice join our work and magnify that impact and convince lawmakers where money needs to go. So we encourage you to sign up on our websites to get these alerts in a timely manner, because it makes a difference, and it's just a way for you to get engaged as well. I also wanted to just point out a couple upcoming events that might be of interest. We're going to do a recap on the science of what happened this past summer with James in our SCCF Marine Lab and Sea Turtle program at the Bailey Homestead on the 15th. That should be a nice program that I think you'll enjoy. Now that you are so energized and we have so many good things moving forward on Everglades, I encourage you to think about joining us in the Keys in January. Where else would you rather be? Duck Key Resort is the place where this year's conference, January's conference, is going to be held. It's the largest gathering of federal, state, local stakeholders, nonprofits. You want to know anything, you want to get resources, you want to partner up, this is a fantastic place to be and to learn what you can. And then March, we'll get very busy, roll up our sleeves, and the 60-day legislative session starts. And then we're really going to need you, because that's when they start spending money. So With that, I thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, so the process again, there's paper and pens in all of the aisles. We have Catherine and Tiffany going around to collect them. But I'm going to ask the very first one, and that is, we have fish here. I'm curious as to what the human impact has been and what has fish seen as a result of all this environmental chaos that we've had. So, please.
Hi, I'm Maggie Feiner. For fish, what we've seen is what I refer to as the perfect storm. It has not only affected our environment and our water quality and our animal life, it has affected all our residents and our workers. To date, I can tell you that fish has signed up 82 new clients for the food pantry. We've been very lucky with a lot of donations that have come in for the food pantry, but we have since then spent $16,000 purchasing food. We cannot keep the shelf stocked. We have a qualifying process that people do go through. We have emergency financial assistance. I will tell you that what I see every application that comes through, we have a committee, reviews every application, all the documentation, which is financial. We look at pay stubs. At the moment, the average hour, or the hours worked per week, is only 16 hours a week. How do you pay your rent? How do you buy food? It's been very difficult. We have to date already documented, cleared 210 cases, and we have spent $86,000 on paying rent, utilities, the medical prescriptions, just trying to keep people afloat until they can get back to work. We've had small businesses approach us, fishing guides, shelling excursions. Their businesses just have not existed. So the impact on the islands has been tremendous. Hopefully it'll clear up pretty soon and we'll get back. We are anticipating that due to the seriousness of this quality issue, we really think we're going to see this affect our fish through the beginning of the year, at least. People have got not only to catch up, they've got to get back to work. So we need our tourism, which we depend on vitally. We need you out there supporting the businesses. For those of you who have supported fish in this time of dire need, thank you. We have collaborated with other organizations, which have been absolutely tremendous. So that's what we've seen.
Okay, thank you. So I am going to address these questions to the panel, and I'll let them decide who should speak. And each of those mics I know is able to be removed. And I know you can't see well in the back, so if it's possible, especially you and me, to stand up while you answer, that would be great. So the first question is, why don't we have a class action lawsuit against the state for the release of toxic water into our system? I like that one, so I started with that one. Is there any legal activity going on along with all of the positive activity in the legislative side?
Yes.
So when it comes to the high flow discharges, it's a little more challenging because the Army Corps of Engineers has some exemptions when it comes to public safety. And when the Herbert Hoover Dike, when the water levels get too high within Lake Okeechobee, they have the ability to discharge that water east and west. While there are restrictions to sending that water to the south, because we have what's called the Everglades Forever Act, which requires the water to meet a certain water quality standard, we don't have that east and west. And people have tried to challenge that. In fact, Lee County filed an injunction. They failed in that challenge, and a number of other folks have failed in those challenges as well. So it's very difficult to sue on the high flow issues. However, the city of Sanibel, along with the a number of the other cities in Lee County, are challenging the South Florida Water Management District on the low flow issues, which, again, it's not the high flow issues, but when we impact the estuary during the dry season, it impacts the resiliency of the estuaries, or the estuary, and it impacts the ability of that filtering system within the estuary to improve the water quality when we are getting those higher inflows. So it's much more complicated. It's not as easy as just let's sign up, let's sue them. You have to have a really good case, and there's a lot of exemptions that wouldn't allow you to win that case.
Just to add on, I mean, this was a conversation, and this was at least a thing that was talked about to see what actions we could do. As James alluded to, both Monday and Tuesday we'll be out actually challenging the Water Managers District along with 5 other cities within Lee County, as well as Captiva has joined us in this action. So it's not like we're sitting here and not doing the things we're able to do. It's just that one was obviously one where we thought we can certainly bring good science and obviously continue to talk about a rule that they tried to pass at a public hearing that just didn't make sense, and obviously their rule would actually have impacts to our estuaries.
All right, thank you. The second one, why doesn't Captiva have a sewer system like we have on Sanibel? I didn't know they didn't. What do you guys do out there?
Well, I could certainly, I mean.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Jay Brown. I'm on the Captiva Community Panel. We have a very active project now where we're trying to evaluate the best long-term wastewater strategy for Captiva. We've completed a major consulting study which has outlined for us what the best central sewer plan for Captiva would likely be, and it would involve partnership with City of Sanibel. Kevin and I and James have been working on this. It would be a very expensive project that, based on what we know right now, would have to be paid for by Captiva property owners. It is a great deal of money. We are not a municipality. We would have to gain public support for this, create a municipal taxing authority to pay for all the costs, of doing it. We're going to have a public presentation of the consulting study in January. We've posted the study on the Captiva Community Panel website, and it's going to come down to determining the degree to which we can rally support within our community to undertake a very expensive project to do this, and that's where it stands right now. The panel is working very actively on this, to try to build the rationale for participating in a central sewer system, but that's where it stands right now, and there'll be a lot more happening on this project over the next couple of months. And I think Kevin and James and Rand's efforts, working with me, on this project.
I think it's important to note, I mean, we're going through an upgrade at Donex on a reclaimed water project that we're all obviously putting in place, what we talked about earlier. So that upgrade will allow us to, at least for council, to consider the possibility of obviously Captiva, if there's a desire on their end, certainly to hook up to our sewer system. So we are very proactive in making sure that when we had our sewer study, we anticipated that, is there a possibility of having the capacity for Captiva. And I could tell you that Jay has certainly been very instrumental, met with many council members, but we just had an updated meeting. So we'll certainly explore that and see what we can do from making the island, obviously, as best as we can for everyone.
Thank you. Based on all these questions, we've moved dinner back to 10:30, so don't worry.
Oh my God, I'll faint.
This one's quick, I hope. Maybe James. How extensive is the dead zone into the Gulf? I think they want to know how far does the damage Iran.
So this is something that SCCF's Marine Lab has undertaken an attempt to quantify, going down through the water column and reaching out, and it got to a point where it was about 600 square kilometers, and we never found the outside edges. Then Hurricane Michael came through, and it mixed those layers of water. So what was causing the dead zone in part was the separation of the oxygenated water from non-oxygenated water full of hydrogen sulfide gas, which is a toxic gas, and that was killing everything on the bottom. When Hurricane Michael came through, circulated the column, the water column, and so now we're not seeing that dead zone, but we did not find the edges of it. And if I could just take a moment on that first question about the lawsuit about releasing blue-green algae water, I would just make the comment that the state does not have any cyanobacteria standards for water quality, even though this is a toxic algae. So this is one of our low-hanging fruit opportunities to fix.
There's a question generally wants to know the larger cities up north. Is there any participation from them that would prevent as much of the bad things entering Lake Okeechobee? Are they involved in this process, or are they saying it doesn't affect us, so we're not all that interested?
Is that referring to Orlando?
Yeah.
Okay. So
I was trying to be nice.
Okay, well, James said, are we talking New York, Ohio? What? How far north are we going? Canada? Those people.
Northerners.
So there are state rules about water quality and stormwater, and big cities like Orlando have requirements for managing their stormwater, and municipalities like the city and the county all have requirements to meet something called the NPDES permit standards, which is stormwater standards. So they're supposed to clean things up. What we know from the monitoring is that the majority of our nutrient, nitrogen and phosphorus, is coming from agriculture, and the big discharge, I might as well just kick this little hive over, is coming into the lake from the north and northeast, which are predominantly dairy and cattle, and a lot of historic nutrients. Part of that problem is because this state has a disconnect between the standards for urban water quality and agricultural water quality. In this state, if you are an agricultural landowner and you sign up for something called a best management practice, it's a cafeteria style plan, you sign up for free, you are given a presumption of compliance with water quality standards. You don't have to be meeting them, and you many cases aren't. So we know in the Caloosahatchee, for example, the high nutrient inflows are coming above into the Caloosahatchee estuary above the Franklin Lock. So that's most of our urban area is west of the lock. Most of that rest of that is agricultural. So it's not so much I wouldn't expect the cities as it is the agricultural lands.
And I just, if I could just add one thing. Rand mentioned the historic nutrients, but we refer to them often as legacy nutrients. And in Lake Okeechobee, there's enough legacy nutrients to pretty much fuel algal blooms for the next 50 years. So that's going to be a very big challenge as we move forward. Because even though if the water coming in was spring water, Evian spring water, we'd still have a nutrient issue. And where the water coming into the lake is, I think it's exceeding the nutrient load by 5 times the nutrient load set by the Department of Environmental Protection. So we have some serious nutrient issues, and every time we get a hurricane or a storm event that passes over Lake Okeechobee, it stirs everything up. And then that water is released. So, it's no coincidence that after a storm event, we see these massive nutrient blooms that occur not only in Lake Okeechobee, but in the estuaries as well.
This is a question I know all of us have. We often hear that the enemy is the sugar industry. What are the realities?
All right. So, we need one of those maps that we had. So the sugar industry is predominantly south of Lake Okeechobee. Not all of that EAA land is south of is sugar that's south of Lake Okeechobee, but it sits lower than the lake. So it is what we consider downstream. For 70 years, they have been growing crops, everything from rice and sugar cane to citrus and row crops. And because those are not water-loving plants, except for rice, they pump the water down, the water table down about 18 inches, and they discharge that water. Over time, exposing those soils that are old, they're old muck soils, they're organic soils, has caused them to literally disappear and vaporize. We've lost between 9 and 25 feet of soil in the EAA. What that means is, south of Lake Okeechobee, you kind of have a bowl that's been created. So the water doesn't naturally flow upstream. Until 2007, though, agriculture was allowed to pump, what we call back pump, from the bowl south of the lake into Lake Okeechobee. And that was adding some nutrients to the legacy that James was talking about. But still, the highest inflows are coming from that northeast quadrant and north of the lake. So sugar cane has contributed in the past because they used to use Lake Okeechobee like their own private reservoir. You have too much water, you pump it into the lake. You don't have enough water, you pump it out of the lake. That was stopped in 2007, and they do have a requirement to clean the water more than any other agricultural operator. I mean, that's just the case. But they started at such a bad level that it's not like it's Evian. But they have met the state-mandated targets. I think I'm concerned when people use the shortcut of, oh, it's the sugar industry. It's sort of like saying all the problems come from the lake. Because it's too easy a target, and it's a missed target. So if the doctor doesn't diagnose your illness properly, you'd be treating the wrong thing. By just using the shorthand that it's all the sugar industry's problem, we treat the wrong thing. We have to treat the whole system, and all of us contribute. So I hope that helps.
But I would add that it might not be all of the issues associated with nutrients when it comes to sugar, because they have done a better job. But where we really have challenges when it comes to when it comes to the water issues in the Caloosahatchee is that we can't move water south because the Everglades agricultural area is south of the lake. And they also take up the majority of the capacity of the stormwater, or the what we call the stormwater treatment areas, and into the water conservation areas. So by them taking up that capacity, it eliminates our ability to actually move water out of Lake Okeechobee, which end up going east and west of the estuary. So our biggest challenge is that, you know, they're an obstacle to moving water south. And we're also maintaining water levels at perfect levels within the farm fields to make sure that we're maintaining that perfect level around the root zone of the plant, which means during the wet season, they're discharging the water somewhere else to keep it dry at a perfect growing rate so they can optimize yields. And during the dry season, they're getting all the irrigation water they need. And that's not going to the Caloosahatchee to make sure that we're balancing salinity in the estuaries. And that's the reason why the South Florida Water Management District is challenging, well, we're challenging them, but the reason why they're pushing back so much on this minimum flow and level rule, because water is a commodity in Florida, just like it is in any part of the country. So I just wanted to add that. So it's not the nutrient issues as much with U.S. sugar maybe, but it is that they're an obstacle to moving that water south.
And if I could just add one thing. So when we talk about the sugar industry in that red area, predominantly right where we need to move that water so that we can get it to this EAA reservoir, as James said, number one, there's an obstacle because they're growing a crop that doesn't want all that water there. And number two, when there's flood control issues, when there's too much rain, it rains on the fields just like it does here, they get in this bowl, they need this flood control relief, and so they're having to move that water out. What we'd like to tee up for you to think about and for a larger conversation to pursue is the idea, instead of, now the U.S. sugar deal that they had entered into with the state in 2007 has fallen apart because they no longer want to sell the land. Fine, they don't want to sell the land. Why don't we pay them to farm water? That's what we need down there, is water, not crops. You don't have to do flood control for water. You just pile it up. You need water to feed the EAA reservoir. So it seems like they can continue to own the land. We don't have to bail them out by taking precious water in the dry season and preferentially delivering it to the EAA, or dewatering and providing them perfect flood control when everybody has a flooding problem. So just a little idea to tempt your appetite.
All right, I'm going to ask one last question, make a couple of comments. I have enough questions literally that we could take 2 days on this, and they're all great. We will leave the questions with the panel, and there may be a way to get answers back in some forum that would be helpful. But one question that came up is, there was mentioned that 24% goes St. Lucie way, 76%, if my math is right, comes our way. Why can't we make it 50-50? Why is that imbalance?
So it's a difference in the size of the outlets. So the Caloosahatchee is 75 miles long. The St. Lucie is 35 miles long. They're a much smaller, tiny discharge point, whereas we are a much larger one. Keep in mind that there was a connection to the west through the Western Everglades and then the Caloosahatchee. On the east side, I don't know that I had the historic aerial, but there was no connection at all. That was all pine flatwoods. So those were created after that hurricane event where they decided to put in the dike, and suddenly they created a brand new discharge point to the east that never existed. At least there was something that had naturally had a flow path. So I want to just prompt this, because this question comes up all the time. In fact, I said to James, I know exactly what that question's going to be. Let's not think about a zero-sum game where it's got to be hurt the lake, hurt the St. Lucie, hurt the Everglades, or hurt the Caloosahatchee. Let's equalize it. This is not supposed to be managing natural resources at the harm level for the benefit of water supply, and yet that's what we're doing. So let's think holistically about our natural resources, because as we pointed out, they do a lot of the work, Mother Nature, for free, cleaning the water, providing fresh water, keeping us all alive. And there are 8 million of us that depend on the water in the Everglades. Keep in mind, too, that by having water in the Everglades, we are unlike any place else at this latitude on the planet. Most of those areas are desert. So the only reason we're not a desert here, in many respects, I think, is because we have the Everglades. So let's not think in terms of a zero-sum game where you have to harm one natural system or resource versus another, but we need to look at the resource as something we share. Harm and help.
Shared adversity.
Shared
How about a hand for the panel, please? So let me ask a question. Has this been helpful? Probably more questions that we have now than when we walked in tonight, which I guess you could expect. Would it be helpful to do this again at some point in the future to kind of track progress and talk about it? Okay. Yeah, the suggestion is to serve us in our chairs and keep the conversation going. No, that would be a no. So with that, I want to thank everybody tonight. Again, the panel, a terrific job. We do have many of you staying for dinner. The chairs and tables have been set up. For those of you who want to kind of linger and ask a few other questions, please do. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Time to retire.